And then I'm curious about afterwards you kind of mentioned how at times you think that he has been very absorbed into Kirsty's kind of world, and to the exclusion of your own family, yourself, your mom, your dad.
Especially me, though.
Especially you. Okay, mostly you. Um, and I guess you use the word kind of like taking for granted, or that it was for granted. And I just want to maybe explore that a little bit. That belief that, yeah, that is it you he's taking for granted?
I guess so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Can you tell me what being taken for granted kind of feels like?
Mm. Um, just invisible. I just feel invisible, unimportant. Um, which is frustrating because, yeah, there's like a lack of acknowledgement, and at the same time, it's frustrating that there's privilege on his side of like, you don't even know, you know,
Mm.
you get a little taste of it. You get to like show up once a month or whatever and get to feel uh, like, you're a good son because you dropped off some peaches or something, but I'm here every day,
Okay, yeah.
like unappreciated.
Unappreciated.
Yeah. Not that I do it for the credit, but it's like I feel like he gets applause for just showing up sometimes.
Mm.
And I'm like the constant presence that even though I don't, he's good at doing like grand gestures.
Yeah.
Uh, like he's invited. I mean, it's never actually happened, but one year he wanted to take my parents to Disneyland for like before Christmas. Well, actually he wanted to take us all, but I was like, no, no. I didn't want to pay for my ticket.
Yeah.
So that was a whole thing, but without getting sidetracked, it was like that, or at some point he invited to take them to the UK because he wanted them to be able to see sort of where Kirsty comes from, or um, and even if it's not such a grand gesture, like I say, he might show up with, "Hey, I went to this farm today, and here's this giant, you know, um, carton of peaches or corn or whatever. Like, here you go." But it's like, yeah, I'm here every day, like maybe setting the table or maybe just just being here to for them to have someone to vent to, or I'm here just worrying with them about the kinds of houses that they're looking at and like having conversations with them. Like I'm doing so much emotional work. Um,
Right. And there's not a lot of recognition there.
no, no.
No. Okay. Within that, like taken for granted, is it from him, or some of the some of the stories you told where like he brought over peaches, he like wants to do some like big travels and stuff, and
Yeah.
I could see how like that might get the applaud of like your parents, right? Or that they're so, it also sounds like they're hungry to see him, right? They're
Yeah.
hungry to have attention, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
is taken for granted definitely from him, and then also from like, is it from your parents as well, or not so much?
Uh, no, I just think because it's my contribution is so every day, they might not say all the time like, "Oh, thank you for
Yeah.
whatever the little contribution is," but when he does something because it's not a constant, they'll say like, "Oh, thank you. Oh, you're so sweet," and blah blah blah. But no, I don't think so. I think they appreciate me. They just don't say it all the time.
Gotcha. The for granted is more hint
Yeah.
specific. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a little bit of feeling there when like he shows up in a grand gesture and it's
Yeah,
like, yeah.
massive eye roll.
Yeah. You had one right now, so I can imagine. Yeah, I'm curious within that. I don't know your culture especially well, but I'm curious if you could kind of give me a little bit. We spoke a little bit about kind of gender roles and expectations in your household. Um, there's this concept that I have a friend who is Korean, and she's spoken to me about like this concept of the little emperor. She has a brother that is like anything he does is just like massively appreciated, right? And she does quite a bit of like of work and hardship, and for some reason the boy is quite often very like favored in a lot of ways, if I could say. And I don't know if that's something that like connects to your experience, or is does that come from a like a Mexican or Latino kind of background, or could you tell me a little bit about that gender role kind of piece?
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that in Latin American, well, Hispanic culture in general. Um, it's a pretty sexist culture. As much as my dad would call himself a feminist, my mom would do the same. And as much as they say, like, their ideals are for us to be considered equal.
Mm,
But I think in practice, that hasn't always been the case. And maybe sometimes the age difference and the gender things get muddled. Like he was allowed to do a lot of things that I wasn't, and I was told that it was because he was older, but sometimes it was because he was a guy, like allowed to go places or allowed to do things on his own and not have like a chaperone. It was like
mm,
I understand it was for my own safety because I was also more at risk as a woman, but um there's been that differential. And I think my parents would probably say it's not to do with gender, it's to do with personalities. David has um something of a like a little emperor thing, but that he was born with. Like
mm.
um
Your
he
parents
just
didn't socialize him into it as much as
no,
he just
no,
walked.
yeah,
Mm.
he just talked down to them when he was like old enough to talk. um and maybe they should have been, I think they maybe should have been harder on him, but I think for a time they just found it amusing, that he would talk to them like some kind of royalty.
Yeah.
Um, or like tell my dad to shut up, or tell my mom like, no, go away, I was wanting to talk to my dad, or like just rude. He was a
Mm.
rude little kid.
Okay, yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
um and I think there's been a difference in, I don't know, I think it's hard to draw the line between what we like, the temperament that we each were born with, and how my parents drew boundaries around that. I think to some extent David is just the kind of person who sets really firm boundaries and nobody's going to bypass them, and if he doesn't want to give, he doesn't, and you just have to accept it. Whereas I've been more um willing to um sort of let my arm be twisted, or like to accommodate. I've been much more accommodating. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that has to do with, well, women are supposed to be more accommodating because you're supposed to be polite and all of
Mhm.
that nonsense, or if it's just the way we're each wired. I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah, either way you can see the difference, and it
Yeah.
yeah. And it doesn't land especially well sometimes.
No.
That yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Like
can
he
hear,
could say
yeah.
something like, "Get out of my room." And they might say like, "That's very rude. That's not okay." But eventually they would leave the room, and he wouldn't appear to care if he was being rude. Whereas if I said, get out of my room, they'd say, that's not how you talk to us, blah, blah, blah. And my response would be more like, oh shit, sorry. Like I'd be more,
Yeah.
I guess, intimidated into being different. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it sounds like you're the way you're describing it could be one, could be the other. It
Yeah.
might not just be socialization. It sounds like your parents are quite self-aware and wanting to right society's like sexism, right?
Yeah.
Yet there's also this trickle down of um at least for him, kind of taking you for granted. And there's this a little bit of maybe your parents don't expect you to dote on him, but there's this like um expectation of how you need to be more accommodating.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
And I think I heard, not terribly often, but I was definitely told, like, don't be like your brother.
Okay.
So,
Some permission there, some not, I guess. Yeah. What
yeah.
so being aware, like you're very aware of that, of both personality and the social constructs of gender and other things like that. So being aware of that, I'm just curious, like what would it look like for you to kind of interact or kind of to walk out, if that wasn't true, that you were being taken for granted, whether or not it's your parents, which your parents, it sounds like they do have a lot of appreciation despite the grand gestures. Like, what would it look like, to believe in your own self, that you're not being taken for granted?
What would it look like if I didn't feel taken for granted?
Yeah.
Um, uh, I think there'd just be more interest in what my life looks like, what I'm planning to do, or just there'd be more of an invitation to talk about like you know, how's your master's program going? Like what's your plan? Or like are you still wanting to move to Montreal? I think, yeah, just some acknowledgement of my not being an extension of my parents. Like, okay, so here's another example. Whenever there's some kind of event that he's hosting, like he invites my parents over for dinner or whatever, he just seems to kind of expect that my parents are going to tell me. So rather than him texting me to say, hey, would you be free on this night at this time? Because we're having a dinner. He just tells my parents, and then my parents will at some point say, hey, we're going to David's on such and such day. Do you want to come? And I'm like, well, no, I wasn't invited.
Mhm.
And they think I'm being ridiculous, but it's like just because I live in the same house, it doesn't mean that I'm an extension of you. I'm an adult with my own life and my own priorities. I don't understand why he's going through you guys to
Mm.
communicate anyway. So
Yeah.
I think if even there was that, like if there was a separate invitation, a separate text message saying, would you be available at this time? That would make a difference because it would make me feel acknowledged as a separate entity, not just, you know.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, both like um, the acknowledgement that you are your own person, and then acknowledgement that he would want you. The invitation even would be, um,
Yeah.
received well.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I'm curious how, like, we all tell ourselves a lot of stories, and those stories have impact, right? So, without changing David or changing your parents or all of society to be less like, um, sexist,
Yeah.
I'm curious what story you could tell yourself in those circumstances, that might bring acknowledgement instead of being taken for granted? What ways could you, there's something that you could say even to yourself, or a reminder, even if it's aspirational,